Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Dr. Chris Moore. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Science at Dalhousie University, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this week's Open Dialogue Live, a series of weekly conversations on current events and featuring Dalhousie experts. Today's episode will feature 4 experts who will dig deeper into the question of how is the current global pandemic impacting the natural world and what will be the long-term effects on the environment. They will share their expertise and perspectives on a diverse range of topics related to nature and COVID-19. We're really pleased that we have here with us today Dr. David Burton, who's a professor in the Department of Plant, Food and Environmental Sciences, Dr. Rachel Chang, an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Physics and Atmospheric Sciences, and Dr. David Barclay, an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Oceanography. And we're really delighted also to welcome live from Washington, D.C., Natasha Daly, a writer and editor at National Geographic, and also a Dalhousie University alumna. During the presentations, we encourage you, our viewers, to post your questions online. And a little later in our program, we'll relay some of these questions to our presenters. So if you're ready, I'll now ask Dr. David Burton to discuss how the pandemic is forcing a transformation of our food system to a more sustainable and resilient system needed to produce the food and to protect our environment. Dr. Burton.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. There are lessons we can learn from COVID that are relevant to our society and our environment. In my talk, I'm going to focus on the food system because I'm in the Faculty of Agriculture and that's one of my central interests. One thing that COVID has shown us is that our economy is fragile, built on a house of cards. COVID was a shock to the economy, bringing it tumbling down. So we now need to ask, how did our system become so fragile? And what can we do to build a more resilient one? The fragility of our economy is a result of it being optimized for least cost, ignoring social and environmental costs. It is our social system that has failed us during COVID. Similarly, impacts on the environment are evident in our changing climate and is likely to bring even greater shocks to our economy than COVID has. The cure to our economy is not, or to this situation, is not simply a vaccine. I know we want to find a vaccine for this current situation, the COVID situation, but we need to look beyond that. We cannot simply return to normal. We must rebuild our economy in a more socially and environmentally resilient fashion. COVID provides an opportunity to build this more resilient economy if we choose to do so. I'm going to focus on the food production system and the resources upon which it depends, our soil. Our food system was surprisingly resilient during COVID, at least initially, because we did not close borders to food. If we had closed our borders to the transport of food, the system would not nearly have been as resilient as it was. Nonetheless, we are now seeing the cracks in the system as COVID shuts down the few meat packing plants that have been left, and farmers struggle to find labor to harvest their crops. Again, all symptoms of least cost global economy. This should cause us to reflect on what constitutes value in our food system and at what cost. What is the cost of food security? Half a century ago, Atlantic Canada had a diverse agricultural industry with the backbone of a vibrant rural community. We produced a diversity of food, including meat, vegetables, fruit, grains. Economic forces and the economies of scale resulted in the specialization of our agricultural production system, reducing the variety of products we produce and increasing our dependence on food grown elsewhere. There are obvious implications for food security, but I want to focus on the impact of that specialization and intensification on our environment, and particularly on our soils. Reduce crop diversity, replacing perennial cropping systems with annual cropping systems like corn and soybean, and increased reliance on tillage and chemical inputs to increase yields and decrease costs have degraded our soils, resulting in a dramatic decline in the health of the soils in Atlantic Canada. These soils provide a wide array of environmental services. Not only do they provide water and nutrients for our crops, but they also clean our drinking water. They are habitat for 1/3 of the plant's biodiversity and are a major sink for atmospheric carbon dioxide. Soil organic matter stores carbon, builds the structure that allows the soils to function properly. The less diverse cropping systems that we've adopted of late and the more intensive tillage we use to manage weeds and support those cropping systems have resulted in less organic matter being retained in our soils. Also, the loss of animal production within the region because meat processing plants have moved elsewhere to process animals more cheaply has resulted in less manure being returned to our land. The declining soil organic matter threatens the continued capacity of our soils to produce and increases their vulnerability to extreme weather associated with climate changes, such as drought or intense rainfall. This increased vulnerability was the hidden cost of the intensification and globalization of our agriculture. COVID has drawn our attention to this. It has caused us to become more aware of the fragility of our economy. It also has provided the opportunity for us to invest in a more sustainable, more resilient economy, rather than simply rebuild the fragile economy that has failed us. There is talk of a green recovery. In an earlier open dialogue session, you heard Dr. Sylvain Charlebois and the producers Philip and Katie Ketty highlight the value of local sourcing of agricultural products to increase food security. I support that. However, we must do more. We must move away from the simple least cost production systems to those systems which also ensure the sustainability of our food production system. The sustainability of production of our production system is part of what we pay when we buy our food. We have to realize we're not simply buying the food, we're also buying the sustainability of the production system that generated it. We need to educate consumers as to the true cost of what they choose to purchase. We need to ensure that our food dollars go to supporting sustainable rural communities and healthy soils, whether here in Nova Scotia or wherever we source our food. Social environmental services are difficult for economists to price and therefore are seldom considered in the true cost of production. They are intangible but critical to the way we build truly resilient economy and a secure food system. One that allows us to deal with shocks like COVID and far more dramatic shocks like climate change is what we need to build that more resilient system. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So that was a very interesting analysis of what's going on the land, so to speak. And now we're going to turn over to what's going on in the air. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Rachel Chang, who's going to provide some insights on how air quality is being affected by reduced emissions into the atmosphere.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you very much for the organizers of this event for giving me this opportunity to tell you all about how COVID has affected air quality and other atmospheric emissions. I had some slide images, and because the atmosphere responds very quickly to human activity, you may have seen some articles in the popular press about some of this. So I'm hoping we can see this slides that I produced or I sent in to the next slide. So this is a satellite image and one example of many that you may have seen in the news. And so this image shows atmospheric nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere. And the figure on the left shows what the average March concentrations were like between 2015 and 2019, where the darker the color, the more NO2 there is. And then in the figure on the right, this shows the same values or the same constituents in the atmosphere, that's NO2 again, but just for 2020. And you can see this is for the northeastern United States, where there's traditionally been a lot of industry. And you can see that there's a marked difference between the figure on the left showing the previous years and the figure on the right showing this year. And what that's really highlighting is that the amount of nitrogen dioxide that's been in the atmosphere has greatly reduced. And that's a reflection of the human activities or the lack of human activities that have taken place during the lockdown. And so there are lots of examples of this. I actually had a great time looking on the internet for various images, and the really other stark images can be found in China and then also in the northern part of Italy, where their industrial belt is. And so this is a global phenomenon where we see reduced concentrations of NO2 specifically throughout from satellite imagery, from satellite measurements. And then I just wanted to highlight in the next slide In the next slide, it shows that at the surface, these are observations made by my colleague at Boston University. And what this is showing is that at the surface level, where you and I would be walking, this is at Kenmore Square, which is one of the subway stations in Boston. You can see that in the dark red line that shows what the weekday concentrations are of NO2 at the surface compared to what it was like in the previous 4 years. And you can see also from this figure that at the surface, the amount of NO2 that you can see in the atmosphere is quite low. And so if we go to the next slide, let me tell you about what actually goes into pollution. So I mentioned these previous slides, these previous figures first, because I think maybe some of you have already seen it in the press, but I wanted to get into a little bit about how what type of chemicals we see in the atmosphere and where pollution and air quality comes from. So in the central figure, maybe I'll ask you to go to the next slide. We have these direct emissions from various industries and various human activities, such as factories and transport vehicles and agriculture. And these go directly into the atmosphere, and we call these primary pollutants because they're directly emitted into the air. And then once in the atmosphere, these chemicals can transform into what we call secondary pollutants, and that's either through chemical reactions or from sunlight. And there's a lot of different chemicals that can form. And so with our reduced, so during COVID, what has been the human activity that has been most affected or reduced are vehicle emissions, because most of us are now working from home. And also there has been some industry reductions. And so the most obvious effect or reaction is that there's been a reduction in primary pollutants. So a gas like nitrogen dioxide, which we just were looking at satellite imagery of, has reduced very noticeably because of our reduced transport, especially. And so that's been a very clear story. The air quality is better because the direct emissions of SO2 and NO2 and NO and any direct emissions have reduced. Carbon monoxide also has also greatly reduced. But the story is more complicated when we consider the secondary pollutants, such as ozone, especially, and particulate matter. These chemicals and constituents of the atmosphere have shown more mixed effects because they depend on other parts of the system, such as sunlight and also chemical reactions that happen. And just because we're reducing our primary pollutants, such as nitrogen dioxide, for example, it doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in other parts or in other chemicals like ozone. And in fact, in some places, the ozone concentrations have actually increased. And it has to do with the chemistry that takes place between nitrogen dioxide and ozone. And so that isn't to say that what we're doing hasn't actually reduced, or our reduced activities haven't improved air quality, because it has. There are lots of places where the air quality has improved because of our reduced human activities, but it doesn't always directly lead to lead to an improved air quality. There are some places where this is the case, but there are other places where this hasn't actually been the result. And I think that's the primary message that I wanted to give you, that there's there's chemistry that's happening in the atmosphere and is not completely linear. One more thing I did want to mention was carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas and not exactly what goes into air quality, is not really an air quality constituent, but it has also been reduced. Sorry, it's just an aside I wanted to mention, because we talk about a lot of us are paying attention to carbon dioxide and how it affects climate. So it's been estimated that carbon dioxide levels have decreased by approximately 17%, or in April, for example. But it isn't really improving, contributing. Sorry, what did I want to say here? We're not really reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. If we were to continue in these 2 months where we've reduced our human activities, we've reduced these 2 months where we've been on lockdown has essentially been about 0.01% of our entire time that we've been emitting carbon dioxide as a species. So we've been emitting carbon dioxide for the last 200 years or so. And in these 2 months, we've reduced our emissions by some percentage. And that's really nothing compared to what's already in the atmosphere, the burden that's already in the atmosphere. So my final conclusion or summary is that the air quality has seen some improvement in some places, especially from the primary emitters, primary pollutants, but the secondary pollutants have a more mixed result and it's not necessarily been reduced. And that greenhouse gases, especially such as carbon dioxide, which we have a cumulative effect, will in the long run have no real impact. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Fascinating. And now to complete the set, we're going to move over to water, and I'm going to pass it over to Dr. David Barclay from the Department of Oceanography to speak about how reduced shipping activity is providing insight into the impact of human-generated noise on ocean life.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot. I'll be perfectly honest with you. This study that we carried out in April basically was a coping mechanism. So we were all sent home, and the first thing we thought was, okay, well, we know there's going to be impact in the ocean. How can we measure it while we're stuck here? We can't go out and deploy any sensors, any hydrophones. So what can we do to pass the time or distract ourselves from the gray cloud? Where's the not exactly silver lining, but the tin lining around that gray cloud that this pandemic has brought over us? And we had the idea of using this wonderful piece of infrastructure located on the West Coast called the Ocean Networks Canada Neptune and Venus Array. And the basic idea of the study was we're just going to go out, we're going to look at the ocean noise historically and presently, make a comparison and see if it got any quieter over the last 3 months. So if you want to go to my first slide there, I can show you the region we're talking about. So yeah, in the top panel there's 2 dashed boxes. One is labeled Neptune, and you can imagine there's a giant cable that runs out from, this is West Coast of Canada, just in case no one recognizes it, Victoria, Vancouver, okay, Seattle down there in the bottom right-hand corner. Yeah, there's a giant cable that runs out to those stars, Clayoquot and Endeavour, and that cable brings back acoustic data in real time. So you could go online right now and download, an MP3 file of what it sounds like 300 kilometers offshore in the Pacific Ocean at 3,000 meters depth right now. It's an amazing little bit of resource. Now the other box there is the Venus Array. That's the box with the 3 and 4 star, and that's right outside the port of Vancouver. And there's a couple hydrophones there as well that have been listening for a few years. And in the bottom 2 squares, B and C, those are just sort of, those give you an idea of where the ships between the West Coast of Canada as well as the port of Seattle are going to Asia. And so that's the shipping lanes known, and the color indicates, density of ships per year, basically. So you can see that, in box B, our sensors they're relatively close to that major shipping lane. The scale there is about 60 kilometers between the Endeavour and that bright red line. And in box C, that's outside the port of Vancouver, we're getting ships driving right over top of us. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and give some motivating factors of why we think we're going to see something in the data. So this is some economic data, and basically at the top there you see in the bar graph at the top you see about a year and a half of import and export data in dollars, and the blue line is this basically it's the number of containers, the number of 20-foot containers. It's called 20-foot equivalent units or something like that. And so you start to see this slow decline happening in maybe December, January, definitely February, and that was the data we had in March, mid-March when the pandemic started. So we thought, okay, there's definitely something here in the economic data. The confusing part is that bottom graph there. This is a bar graph as well as a line graph of what's called AIS. This is called the Automated Identification System. And basically, all ships have to have a beacon transmitting where they're going, how fast they're going, what type of ship they are, who they are, and all this stuff. And so that you can, sort of all these giant commercial vessels, you can get a good idea of tracking them. And basically there, we're not really seeing a super convincing trend. We weren't really too sure if there were actually less ships leaving and entering the port of Vancouver, but we did know there was less dollars. So that was sort of a motivating factor. So let's go to the next slide. So this is just like the nice plot that Rachel showed of the NO2 in Kenmore Square, except this is the year against year comparisons of weekly mean power. So that's the sound energy over the entire week averaged at 100 hertz. So this important part here is we're looking at this frequency it's low in frequency, kind of like low on the piano keyboard, like a tuba, something you would play through your subwoofer, or it's the sound of an engine, really. It's the sound of the engine, the gearbox, and the propeller turning in the water. So we're really trying to choose a frequency where we hear mostly just ship noise. There's lots of other noises in the ocean created by wind and rain and other processes. So we're trying to avoid the contamination by those natural processes. And this is a whole year of data, several years of data plotted against each other for the two stations, the Endeavour station and the Clayoquot Slope station. And actually, if we start with the Clayoquot Slope station on the right-hand side, panel B, you can see that both the median and the first percentile being the quietest part of that entire week, are pretty much lay on top of each other. There was pretty much no change. So that was the first, all right, maybe there's nothing here. But actually, it's pretty encouraging if you look at the Endeavour. There is between January and April 1st, there's about a 1.5 dB reduction in both of those metrics, the median and the first percentile. So basically, it's about 15% quieter in terms of power, or in terms of the amplitude, that's 30% quieter. It's decibels. Don't even worry about it. The worst unit, nobody likes decibels, but it's about 15% less energy. I think that's the intuitive thing here. So it's not a huge reduction. Now keep in mind, this is in 3,000 meters of water. The shipping lane's 60 kilometers away. So that gives you this idea that when you're in the deep ocean, you're like in this huge basin and things are traveling, sounds propagating from very, very far away and arriving at your sensor. So you're listening to a real ensemble of sounds. It's sort of like being in a cathedral and just hearing all the murmuring of all the people. It's so reverberant, sound travels very well in that environment. So this was sort of an encouraging result. And then the next slide shows the results from the Strait of Georgia. So this is right outside of Port of Vancouver. And we were very confused by this at first. So this is not a plot like the last plot, because if you plot just the mean weekly power as a line, it makes no sense. And that's because essentially, things had happened to this underwater hydrophone. It had been knocked over sometime in 2019, and then they replaced it with a new one later in that year. And then they had actually just changed out the whole system. Like, it was a calibration nightmare. The line made no sense. And actually, we almost gave up then. But we came up with this idea that instead of looking at the mean weekly power over the entire year, we were going to look at the week over week change. So basically ask the question, is next week louder or is it quieter than this week? And we did that for from October 2018 all the way up to April 1st, 2020. And a week is kind of the right time scale to look at in terms of averaging, because you can imagine if you took 1 minute sample, there might be a ship there might not be. And if you take a whole day average, well, it might be quieter on Sunday than Saturday. So the noise on your signal when you average over a day or a minute is too high. And a week sort of gets onto that human time scale. So you kind of get a very stable estimate week to week to week. And you can see for each quarter, so every period of 3 months, we've fit a little colored line. We've done a least squares fit. to all the week over week changes. And you can see that, in 2018 and 2019, that line is pretty flat all the time. And it's basically saying the noise doesn't really change that much in outside the Port of Vancouver. You kind of have the same ships coming in and out, the same numbers. It's nothing's true dramatic. Yeah, sure. Some days it might get a little louder than others, but as soon as you hit that January 2020, that line starts going down quite dramatically. And so using that, we estimated that the power had gone down by almost half. We had 5 dB, 6 dB is half. Maybe from your car stereo, but 5 dB, almost half. And so that was pretty encouraging to see that. Now, the real question for us now that we're trying to figure out for our next paper to follow up on this is, why did that happen? So our gut says, well, it's because there's less ships, but it's not so clear from the data. We know there was less dollars, but there could be other reasons for the sound decreasing. They could have sent smaller ships, could be doing the routes that are normally done. They could be going more slowly, or it could be actually a reduction in recreational traffic, which we know has totally dropped off. So there's still many, many more questions to be answered. And actually, there's a great group of scientists called the International Quiet Ocean Experiment, and they're organizing all the people who study underwater acoustics and all the data sets. And we're going to try and attack this question on a global scale to really understand in the entire, around all the world's oceans, how noise has been changed. And of course, this has great impacts on the marine animals, which use sound for all sorts of different things and who are impacted by human sound. We expect that there will be many studies by biologists and ecologists to try and quantify how this reduction in sound may have impacted different marine animals. And I think that's about it. You can check out our paper at great newsstands near you. Journal of Acoustical Society of America. It's very popular.
Thank you, David.
Yeah,
that was great. So now we're going to pick up on the theme I think that David left us with, which is the impact on animals. And I'm really happy to introduce Natasha Daly to provide insight on how animals are being impacted more generally, from those in zoos to those in the wild, and what it might mean for our conservation efforts. So Natasha, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Daly. I'm a writer at National Geographic in Washington, D.C., where I cover animals. So I write about all things animals, wildlife, animal welfare, conservation, etc. So over the last few months, my reporting, as well as the work of my colleagues on my team, has really been dominated, of course, by the pandemic and how coronavirus has impacted animals in a multitude of ways. So I think I want to talk a bit about a few threads that I think have dominated, my coverage over the past few months and how the pandemic has impacted animals. I think to start, one of the big storylines that we have been following is how animals are able to contract the disease, and animals that have tested positive. So early on, there were a few cases in Hong Kong and Belgium of domestic cats and dogs testing positive for coronavirus. This was followed by, I think, what was a pretty major breakthrough in our understanding of how animals can contract the disease, the virus. Around April 6th, the Bronx Zoo in New York announced that one of their tigers had tested positive for the novel coronavirus. This was a pretty big deal. This was the first wild animal on the planet, captive wild animal that had tested positive for the the virus, and the first animal in the United States. So it hit a few pretty major milestones, I think, for our understanding on how the virus can impact animals. As it turned out, a few weeks later, the zoo announced that a total of 8 big cats, including, I believe, 5 tigers and 3 lions, had tested positive. It's believed they contracted the virus from an asymptomatic zoo worker. All animals are still expected to recover. Their initial symptoms were coughing, respiratory symptoms. They were tested for regular tests were conducted for other things. They came back negative, and so the zookeepers decided to go ahead and test for the virus. And the tests were processed. The samples were processed by veterinary labs at Cornell and at the University of Illinois here in the US. And a lot of people asked me when I first reported this story, are they, at the time, there was a huge testing shortage in the US, and, a lot of people were concerned, are the animals taking tests away from the people? And the answer is no. These samples were processed in veterinary labs, which wouldn't process human samples anyway, so there was no overlap. So I think the big question here, just last week, it was announced that some minks on mink farms in the Netherlands had tested positive, and a big question remains as to whether the minks, in fact, passed the virus to humans. And so I think that's the million-dollar question here. To date, there has been no concrete evidence that captive animals or pets can transmit the virus to humans. It's only the other way around. So I think that that's although we don't have evidence, that's still a big open-ended question that scientists are working on. There is some indication that some of the minks may have transmitted to humans on the farms. And I think that that's kind of the race to understand right now, whether there's anything there. So I think that that's sort of the question we're still tracking. As a reporter, I'm still just, tracking the cases and animals around the world and how that's sort of going to develop. Again, many unanswered questions. Another kind of big thread I've been focusing on in my reporting is really early on, I'd say early March, there were a lot of stories that kind of made the rounds on social media and in the news about wild animals and wildlife sort of bouncing back once we retreated. So I think as soon as sort of lockdown started, quarantine measures, people were recommended to stay at home. That sort of dovetailed with a lot of reports that wild animals were coming back into cities. When we retreat, animals sort of prosper. And a lot of these, I wrote a couple stories debunking some of these tales as false. For example, there were reports that dolphins were in Venetian canals. They were actually in Sardinia, 1,000 miles away, and various other reports of animals sort of thriving when we retreated. And it was interesting for me personally, I guess from a sociological perspective, that people were so willing to sort of believe these stories and share them. And I think, and I talked to, experts at the time, and they had said that, there's a drive to think that there's some sort of silver lining to this virus in nature. And the story that animals would sort of thrive when we're in the midst of this, horrific crisis was something that people really gravitated towards and wanted to believe. But as I learned, these sort of false narratives about animals thriving and bouncing back can actively really undermine active conservation efforts. And I think that this is sort of the key point and why it sort of matters, why these white lies about animals being in places they're not actually matters, is because so I was in speaking with conservationists. The belief that all we have to do is sort of retreat and go indoors in order for animals to sort of thrive and recover is a very sort of simplistic and actively harmful narrative, because there are environments that we have altered to the point where, those species cannot recover without our intervention. So I think that the idea that this would happen is something that has frustrated a lot of conservationists I've spoken to. Another point is that I also learned, and I found this really interesting, that people are actually less likely to support conservation initiatives once they find out that these stories turn out to be false. So it can be really demoralizing. You can feel sort of silly for falling for one of these bounce back stories if it isn't true. And so you may just say, I don't believe anything, and I don't want to sort of continue to be interested in these things, which is another factor as to why it's ultimately just so important to conservation recovery, animal recoveries as they are actually happening, even if it isn't sort of this quick bounce back that we're hoping for. And the last thing I want to touch on quickly is, of course, the root of all this. So as we know, one of the earliest outbreaks of the virus was in a wildlife market in Wuhan, China. We know that the likely original animal source of the virus were bats. We don't yet know the intermediary reservoir. And that's something that, scientists are really working on to try to figure out how the virus jumped from animals to people. This is a zoonotic disease. It's originated in wildlife at some point. And so I think that there's been a lot of focus over the last few months on the wildlife trade and how the live animal trade trade has sort of made this environment where these viruses are easily able to jump into humans. And I think that sort of, one expert described these wildlife wet markets to me, where live animals are sold for human consumption as a sort of cauldron of contagion. So you have animals that may, 3 days before may have been pulled from the wild or pulled from a farm. And you have all these species, sometimes 25 species together in a very small area. They're usually in very poor health, bleeding. They're secreting fluids. All of these sort of factors mean that it creates this environment where viruses may easily be able to sort of jump and mix, and sort of it's this situation that sort of gives rise, I think, in a lot of cases, to the possibility that a virus could emerge. So that's sort of another, I think, if there is a silver lining on at least people's new attention towards the wildlife trade and the wildlife markets in this virus, it means I think a lot of people didn't really know that this trade existed before, and so it's sort of emerged as sort of a new focus. China has banned the sale of live animals for consumption, which is a pretty landmark step. I think that is one step, of course, but live animals are sold all over the world for consumption, for parts, etc. I mean, in markets all over the world. So this is not a China issue. It's truly a global issue. So it'll be sort of the big question of whether this pandemic will, cause and propel other countries to act on cracking down on the both legal and illegal wildlife trade. So I think that that's something that I'll be following a lot going forward. And yeah, I think that kind of wraps up my few minutes here. So just want to touch on a few things that we've sort of been looking at from an animal perspective with the virus.
Thank you, Natasha. That was great. So, wow, we have a lot to talk about here. We've had a whirlwind tour of the Earth, the sky, the ocean, and of course, the inhabitants of our planet. So, ask away if you have questions. Thanks to our speakers, Dr. David Burton, Dr. Rachel Chang, Dr. David Barclay, and Natasha Daly for providing your expertise and knowledge on how the global pandemic is impacting the natural world, and your insights on these long-term effects on the environment. So we've had a number of questions come in from our viewers. We're going to take a few minutes now to answer some of those questions. So our first question is for the whole group, and you can see who wants to jump in first. So what is the silver lining that we can learn from the effects on the environment from the pandemic, and how can we use that to make positive changes? So why don't we go to David? David Burton put his hand up first. So go ahead, David.
Well, I think there's two things. I think one, this shock to our system has made us aware of how fragile our economic system is, and how it can be so easily disrupted by social and environmental impacts. So I think it's important for us to be aware of that. I think the second thing is it also is causing governments to realize that there's an opportunity to inject funds into the economy to stimulate recovery. Well, I think those funds can be used to positive benefit to green our economy and rebuild a more sustainable economy. So I think that is a tremendous once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, David. Rachel, any thoughts?
I'm gonna, this is related to another question that's up there, but one of the silver linings is that it's really helped us realize how much of the human emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere can really change the air that we're breathing. And one of the silver linings as a scientist is that we're conducting this natural experiment where we're essentially turning off all the traffic emissions into the atmosphere. And the modelers, I'm certain, are having a field day because they're constantly trying to estimate exactly how much is going to the atmosphere from all this car traffic. And suddenly the world's done it for them, and now they can see how their models react to this. So from a scientific point of view, that's been a silver lining. Yeah, for humans, obviously, the air is cleaner, and those of us who are at least walking around our neighborhoods can probably feel that all over the world. I mean, it's not as significant in Halifax because our air is already very clean. But as somebody else pointed out, in a place like India, where the primary emissions are really high, the air is definitely much cleaner now.
And
Yeah,
David?
Yeah, I can jump on Rachel's comment about how for scientists it's like just a great opportunity. Yeah, especially from the modeling perspective, like we have all these regulators that would love to understand how to regulate ship noise and understand more on how more about the impact that ship noise has on the underwater environment. And so we're starting to develop models that explain, small changes in marine traffic and the habitat. But now all of a sudden we have a data point that's way out here, right? So our models have to become more robust to be able to explain, great deviations from normal. And to do that, we just have to have a better understanding of what the important variables are, what the important physics is, what the important, aspects of the ships are. And so that, that's a positive. And I think we'll see going forward many, many studies on the animals themselves. So behavior, physiology, that will prove very insightful, and that will just take advantage of this blip, at least for underwater noise.
Yeah, thanks, David. And Natasha, from your perspective, what do you see as the silver lining?
Yeah, sort of like I touched on a little bit. I think a general awareness about the wildlife trade and how our incursions into nature and wildlife habitats have, in many ways, given rise to the ability of these pandemics to sort of take hold and the virus to spread. I think that general public awareness about a topic that maybe people didn't know about before is a positive thing, and it may lead to changes in policy and in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Okay, next question for David Burton. This pandemic has shined a light on the need for local food production. So what steps can be taken in the long term to strengthen reliance on local food production?
I think local food production is important, and it would have been even more important if we closed down our borders. But I think we have to think beyond simply local food production. I think it has to be sustainable local production. Even in Nova Scotia, some of the agricultural practices we are using are causing the degradation of soils and threatening the viability of the soil. So more than just local, we have to invest in sustainable production systems and realize that when we're buying a carrot, we're buying more than simply a carrot. We're buying that production system that produces the carrot. And so an awareness of that, I think, is critical. But also awareness, the fact that we do have to have food security within Nova Scotia and be aware of where our food comes from, and who grows it, and the viability of the communities in which those people live.
Yeah, that's great. And just a plug for the Faculty of Agriculture, it's great that we have you guys out there in Truro Bible Hill doing that work for us. It's so important.
Thank you.
Next, for Natasha, in the case of the mink farms, what was the role of domestic cats in virus transmission? Do we know?
Yeah, so my colleague is actually reporting a story on that now. She'd be the best person to ask about this, not me. But I think in terms of, I think we don't know for sure. I think the studies are still being conducted. We don't yet know how I guess, we don't have evidence yet in terms of what the domestic cats, how they played a role in their transmitting the virus to the minks or vice versa. So I think that's something that's still very much, still very much waiting for the answer on that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
That's fine. David Barclay, are you able to make any inferences from your research on how reduced shipping is impacting things in and around Halifax Harbour? Obviously a big shipping terminal here.
Yeah, so it will be interesting to see. We know that we have recorders. Well, we don't. DFO has recorders out there right now, so we will get that answer. We know that the pandemic started in China, so affected the West Coast shipping sooner than the East Coast, if there is an effect on the East Coast. So that's why we started looking in January. There's also this fact of the rail blockades that I think also played a role in reducing some of the exports out of Vancouver. So there's definitely some details to be teased out there. In terms of Halifax, yeah, like I said, we'll get the answer eventually. And I think part of the nice thing about this type of study is that at some point we should be able to go from the AIS data, that data that the ships are transmitting, right, of where they are, what type of ship they are, and just be able to predict underwater noise very reliably. So, you know, in a perfect world, we'd be doing that right now with the Halifax AIS data, but we haven't yet. So,
right, there's still time.
Yeah.
All right, next question for Rachel. So whatever change we've seen, is it really a temporary blip, or how can we use the data being collected to affect real and lasting change in our atmosphere?
So I would say that yes, what we're seeing right now is a temporary blip in the greenhouse gases for sure. Something like carbon dioxide, which is we have this at least 200 year, if not longer, emission into the atmosphere. This is definitely a tiny temporary blip, a very small blip in the whole thing. How can we use this data to affect real and lasting change? I think the best way to harness it is to say, you know, even with all the measures that we're doing right now, it is only a temporary blip, and it's actually very easy to go back to where we were. And so really we need to make significant changes in our emissions in order to make real lasting change.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay, Natasha, here's a good one for you. How can we hone our animal fake news detector?
I like that. That's a good one. Yeah, I have my friends and family are constantly texting me saying, you know, I saw this one on Facebook. Is it real? How can I tell? I mean, first of all, if something seems a little too good to be true, then maybe that's a sign that you should dig a little deeper before you press retweet. You know, I think generally, what I tend to do personally when I'm reporting these out is I actually look at the comments. Often a lot of locals from that part of the world have commented and said, you know, this was a case with some animals that were in some swans that were in Venetian canals, that the story was they came here because everyone's socially distancing. In reality, when I looked at kind of the responses, a lot of Burano Venetian locals said, oh no, they're always here. This is not related to the pandemic. So I think that, I mean, just the takeaway is just to sort of dig a little deeper before you share that news. I think that this pandemic has shown us in many ways, some much more harmful than others, that the spread of false information can be very damaging. So even if it's something as innocuous as animals being in places they aren't, I'd say just think twice before you share something. And, you know, keep in mind that it often takes a lot of work and a lot of time for animals to sort of bounce back and recover. And, you know, a few weeks of us socially distancing may not be the thing to do the trick.
Yeah, that makes sense. You probably all saw the photos of dinosaurs roaming the streets of New York.
Yeah.
Animals in the wild coming back.
Exactly. Yeah, I kind of love that it kind of took on a life of its own. So hopefully that means it's sort of become it's resonated with people. These fake stories not being so real at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So I think we're pretty close to wrapping up, and so maybe I'm going to throw out maybe a controversial question for the group and say, for each of you, how long do you think we should extend the lockdown to get maximum benefit? Rachel, I'll go to you first.
Maximum benefit in what?
In the relief from the damage that we're doing to our planet.
Oh,
I
would say in terms of air quality, I would say that the summer months are the worst in North America, especially in I guess in the northern hemisphere, the mid latitudes of the northern hemisphere, I should say, because that's when the sun is the strongest, and that's when most of the chemical photochemistry happens, and that's when the smog is the worst. And so, you know, if we could really extend to improve air quality, it would be over the summer months.
So we should all lock down in the summer and open up in the winter again, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the problem though is that then we'll all run our AC units very high. You know, there's a lot of other industries or emissions sources that are still going on. You know, the only thing we've really shut off right now are vehicles, but we're still burning carbon dioxide to heat up our homes or run the air conditioner. So there's a lot of things that haven't changed in terms of emissions.
David Barclay?
I think maybe one thing that would be nice is if the lockdown could exclude some of the biologists and ecologists who need to get out there and observe these things rigorously, and so we can get some really good quality publications out there. So, we know it's going to go on at least for a little while longer here in Nova Scotia, but maybe some people could get an exemption card.
Yeah, I'd vote in favor of that. Let's go to David Burton, and then we'll end up with Natasha.
Well, as from an agricultural perspective, we need to get out there now because we have to produce a crop, and we have some climatic and seasonal constraints. So, sooner the better. But I think the real question is, I don't think we need to ever think about returning to the old normal. I think we do have to start envisioning a new normal where we're doing things more sustainably and focusing on the fact that it's not just what we produce, but how we produce it that's important.
That's great, thanks. And Natasha, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, sort of what David Barclay touched on, that, the field work for conservationists and a lot of, scientists studying animal behavior has really been interrupted. In some cases, it's been set back, a year or so. And so that's obviously going to affect studies on animals and animal behavior going forward. But I think the kind of overall, if the question is, how long should the lockdown last in order to have sort of a positive impact on animals? I mean, I think it's less about the lockdown and more about what we take from this pandemic in terms of how we are going to approach the wildlife trade going forward. And sort of China's already taken a step on that, but I think a lot of experts would say it would have to go even further, not just in China, but in South America and Africa and North America, all over the world. So that is sort of my big question ultimately, is this going to affect policy towards the wildlife trade, international trade, national trade, et cetera, going forward? And I think that will be the key to prevent something like this from happening in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Well, listen, this has been a really, really fun and fascinating conversation with you all. And I want to thank you so much for participating, Natasha, the two Davids and Rachel. That's all the time we have for today. But please join us again for another open dialogue next Thursday at 2:30 Atlantic time for a discussion on politics, policy, and privacy. So thanks to everyone who joined us live today. Stay well and take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.